Okay, who here collects stuff? Who here's a pack rat in any sense of the word? You know what? Yeah, I've got something for you. It actually pays off sometimes. He's going to tell us why having stuff is interesting. So, we're going to get right into it with a thirst for stuff. Dr. Bird.
Thank you. I have a lot of people to thank here tonight. I hope my voice lasts. I first want to thank the woman sitting on the stool at the front for carding me. There's not enough hair dye left for me to sneak into these things anymore. And of course, I also want to thank Eric and Kelly for setting this up. I want to talk about some souvenirs that are in the collection that I work in. And really, the talk is really about longing and the way that you feel about this stuff in terms of the very human act of collecting the historical past. And I want to take you back in time to the founding of the Smithsonian. And you might think that the historical objects that you see around the mall today were always there. And in fact, with the founding of the institution, they were not. It really wasn't until about 1881 that they built a completely separate building as a national museum. This is it's now called the Arts and Industries Building, but it's next door to the castle. And when the thing opened, it was pretty much wholly given over to the domain of science. And it's being parodied here in this Puck cartoon, which is from 1885, and it's entitled the Universal Church of the Future, based on, will we see the caption? No, we won't. Okay. It's the Universal Church of the Future based on present religious outlook. It wasn't really until 1883, 1884, that the government decided that we should put all of our historic relics into the National Museum. And so they went up to the U.S. Patent Office, which had this great gallery, which is now the Art and Portrait Gallery. And they brought down George Washington's artifacts that you see here set up in at a completely different later time. But they were all duly cataloged as ethnographic artifacts by the Department of Anthropology. And as this historical relic section grew, they began to make other little divisions. They would have furnishings, costumes, that sort of thing. And by the time you get to the 1920s, you have a completely separate history department that's quite separate from anthropology. So this brings us up to the present day with this little collection that I work in. And it's a kind of these are things that were sort of unclaimed and not taken in all of the subsequent organizations of the museum. These are the things that nobody wanted. Now, just to go all white here on you for a minute, in talking to people back at the bar, I realized there are quite a few people here that are not taken and unclaimed. Is that true? That's really much why you're here, right? Unclaimed and not taken. Well, I'm here to suggest a kind of redemptive narrative of the unclaimed and the not taken. And it's right here in this drawer. And the first thing you notice about these things is that they're quite small. Actually, this is something that would fit in the palm of your hand. And the other thing, a unifying characteristic of them, is that they're relatively nondescript. I mean, it's a piece of granite with quartz veins. If it didn't have the label on it, you wouldn't know that it was a piece of Plymouth rock that somebody whittled away, chipped away from the rock in 1830, which is something that you could do. Or you wouldn't really know that this is a sugar cube-sized piece of the Bastille that someone collected in France from the ruins of the Bastille. We also have lots of famous hair, which is huge in the 19th century. We also have a piece of London's Newgate Prison, which figured as a memorably bleak setting in the work of Charles Dickens. And we have a piece of Joan of Arc's dungeon, which is something you don't see every day. And this was excavated in France by a group of Americans who felt we needed a statue to the Maid of Orleans that they modeled in 1915. And they learned about the availability of these so-called dungeon stones that they used in the pedestal for the statue here. This is on Upper West Side of New York. So what does all this mean? I mean, it's somewhat ironic that you have these unclaimed and untaken things, in as much as the reason that they exist is that somebody took them in the first place. And in the dark corners of the collection, and the kinds of things that you really don't see out on display in the Smithsonian, are really object lessons in the way that we that Americans once thought that they could preserve the past. And you could also talk about these things in terms of just the 19th century mania for relic hunting, which is what it was called. That actually even borders on vandalism. The idea that you would go take a visit to Mount Vernon and come away with a piece of it, that was really not an odd idea at one time, but because it really was the kind of thing people did in advance of a preservation movement that actually began at Mount Vernon, and is the place that eventually figured out that they could sell postcards and that would satisfy a kind of demand for the real thing, so to speak. Or we could also talk about how we no longer use the word relic. We actually substitute relic, and we call them historical artifacts now. Or you could talk about the way that people are expressing themselves. It's almost for a preference for a romance, a kind of a romantic past that longs achingly for some kind of connection. And I just want to read the inscription. This is it's a popsicle-sized stick of wood that someone chipped away from a building, and they put it in the back of like a business envelope. And it says, "A chip from the building in which Andrew Jackson began to practice law, Salisbury, North Carolina, April 7, 1774. Or, and this is the last one, these 4 cards punched I carried with me throughout the United States, thence to Mexico, afterwards around the world, thus preserving the punch marks of the railroad conductors of the globe." Now, if you know anything about Metro cards, this isn't going to mean anything to you. But each conductor's punch is unique, and this man made it his business to collect them all as he experienced them. And that's really the point, because these kinds of triumphal little souvenirs, they gave meaning and a tangible kind of an embodiment of an experience. And if you could touch history, you could chip it, you could whittle it away, you could punch it, and you could whittle it into pocket-sized bits that kind of lived on in your imagination as an example of the real thing, and it lingered on as just that kind of a personal connection. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Questions? Oh, Simon's got something. So Simon's a former speaker, so this better be good. A lot of pressure on you.
So I actually don't have a question. I just want to congratulate you on coming up with the classiest way of describing thirst as a meat market.
You're so kind.
Thanks, Simon.
I was thinking that slide of the people kind of like looking up, you know. That was kind of the thirst of its day in the old Arts and Industries building. Anyone else?
Wait, hold on, we got one. No, go ahead. Sorry, you're next. Go ahead.
So I think you gave a lot of really excellent historical examples of, good historical examples of, little pieces of history chipped away and then cataloged. Can you give some quick perspective about modern day vandalism and people collecting these types of artifacts?
Actually, today, it's just totally discouraged. But in the 19th century, there really was the heyday of that. I mean, there are so many examples that you could cite. One of my favorites is in our museum we have Horatio Greeno's statue of George Washington, and he's seated, with the Roman toga. Are you familiar with that? And I learned that, well, the thing used to be outside on the Capitol grounds, and that there was a reception for Admiral Dewey or something, the hero of Manila, and that the crowd was so big they began to sit on the statue, and that it talked about the vandalism that began to occur before the police intervened. And then they said, and this is what killed me, is on a previous occasion someone had taken George Washington's toe. You know, it's a giant toe that sits out in the sandal, you know. And I read that, and I ran down and looked at it, and I thought, oh my God, you could see where it was, you know. And I know now, so somewhere there's this granite-shaped, you know, cuticle, you know, of George, you know. Or maybe they found it and they put it back, I don't know. But in terms of the current day, I mean, we still collect this kind of thing. But as I said, we call it something else. But the way that we collect it, it's either from somebody who has it, you know, that they collected it, and this is something, you get the story, you get their story. It's not just us going out and getting sample specimens or what, or, you know.
So what happens to all of these artifacts? Because the first time I'm seeing them is on these slides. Are they actually shown to the public?
Yeah, of course there'll be an inevitable book and a show. In the castle.
He's in negotiations.
In August 2013. It's called Souvenir Nation.
On that note, let's give it up for Dr. Bird.